Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. Being as we've just passed the 1 year anniversary of the accession of King Charles III to the throne, we got a bunch of really stupid polls in the media about how Canadians are more likely to want to reconsider our ties to the monarchy. Which is dumb because we don't have ties to reconsider because the monarchy since 1931 has been Canadian. We are not under a foreign imposition. The Canadian crown is the Canadian crown. We are not a subject of the crown of the United Kingdom, and not enough people understand this. And so when you get pollsters making questions like this based on a false premise, you get a lot of answers where people don't understand what they're actually answering. So that's the first part here. But the second part is that there is actually no discussion about what this would actually entail. And that's kind of a big deal because part of it is the fact that we'd have to essentially rewrite the entire Constitution. You can't just search and replace king or queen with president because there's a completely separate organizing principle behind that. The crown in the current Constitution is the central organizing principle by which all of our constitutional mechanisms work. And if we were to replace that with the president, the Constitution would need some different mechanism of granting authority, whether that's through the people or whatever, but that can't come from thin air. That has to, you can't just search and replace the crown with a different mechanism. You have to actually build that into it in a separate way. And as most Canadians know, opening the Constitution in this country has become something like Pandora's box because of the failed constitutional negotiations in the late 80s and early 90s under the Mulroney government, which led to the second Quebec referendum and very, very nearly wound up with a secession vote. Because these negotiations get so tense and heated, and also because we are at a particular place where if you open the Constitution to do one particular thing, that's not a one-off, and there are particular exceptions for that. We just saw something around that last year around a particular taxation issue with rail in Saskatchewan, which was a weird constitutional bug, but they did a one-off constitutional amendment for that. But if you want to do something broader or more sweeping, then the moment you do that to do one thing, then everyone has a demand about something else they want, such as more Senate seats or things around the division of powers or things like that. Recognition about being a nation, which we've had a bunch of really bad constitutional attempted amendments over the last couple of years around that as well. It's bad. They don't actually count, but we just haven't had a court challenge to strike it down. So it's very messy territory, and that I don't think necessarily gets any kind of airplay when we talk about what it would take to replace the monarchy. But the other problem here is that we have no consensus about what we would replace it with. And you get some people who say, well, we could just have an appointed head of state who acts like the governor general does today, and we just keep carrying on as normal. Which maybe that could work, but is that what people want? They tried this in the Australian referendum, and that got soundly defeated. And since then, support for the monarchy has actually increased in Australia because they didn't like the alternative that was on offer. So that's something we need to consider as well. So what kind of a model would we be replacing it with? Appointed head of state, probably not going to fly because we're so close to the US that we would have expectations around a general election for a presidential position, a head of state, whatever we want to call it. But what kind of powers would they necessarily have? Would they want to maintain something similar to the ceremonial aspect of the crown currently, so that Parliament remains the supreme authority and the Prime Minister has the continued head of government function? Okay, well, what does that look like in terms of electing a president? There are people who bring up the Irish model where you have an election for a nonpartisan president who acts very much in that ceremonial role, doesn't have a lot of political or constitutional powers. But we have to look at the flip side of how we get there. Ireland is the size of a postage stamp. Canada is a much vaster country, and it costs millions and millions and millions of dollars to run an election. And to run an election for a presidential position would cost an immense amount of money to run an effective campaign coast to coast to coast, which is partially why we've had problems in the past around things like the notion of Senate elections. Pre-Confederation, they had actually partially elected Legislative Council, which was the precursor to the Senate, but the cost of electing each of those members was so high because they were through the entire province or colony, as it were, that it became prohibitively expensive, and that was one of the reasons why Canada has an appointed Senate, because the experience of trying to elect those positions was incredibly expensive, and trying to scale that up to a presidential-sized election is going to be absolutely enormous. And the other factor to consider there is organization. So if you want this to be a nonpartisan role, can you actually do that with the current systems in place around fundraising and organizing? Because all of those belong to political parties. So if you want to run for a presidential position in this theoretical future, who would you have to use, to do the kind of work for fundraising, volunteers, mobilization, campaigning, so on? That is all basically within the party structures. And so if you're trying to have a nonpartisan position, you may not be able to do that by having to build up an entire campaign infrastructure from the ground up. You would have to basically borrow from the parties, and your nonpartisan position may in fact become a de facto partisan position. And that could be a real problem. Part of that problem would have to do with how they exercise their powers, what powers they have vis-a-vis the Prime Minister, and what kind of constitutional veto powers they have. And when you think about our current head of state, the king, and as represented by the Governor General or the Lieutenant Governors, their constitutional veto powers are constitutional fire extinguishers. They are extreme circumstances only. One of the only times that a Governor General has really stepped in was back Sir Charles Tupper. I think it was Tupper, where he had lost an election very badly and tried to make a bunch of appointments. And the Governor General at that point said, "No, you lost. I'm not making these appointments." And that essentially forced his resignation because the Governor General had denied his advice. He simply hadn't resigned after the election because of the transition of power. He had seemed to think that he could somehow still retain the confidence of the House, even though there was no possible math by which that could happen. But he still wanted to test it first, and before he did that, he wanted to make a bunch of appointments. The Governor General was like, "No, not going to have it." So that's kind of the thing we would have to think about in terms of what kind of powers this theoretical president might have in this theoretical nonpartisan position, and if they become a de facto partisan because of the way in which the elections were run, that's something we need to consider. There are also other people who would want a very empowered president who would have much more robust powers vis-a-vis a prime minister, and who could veto legislation because they admire the American system of logjam and think that it's great that you can use it to limit the powers of government. And then you have a lot of other problems that result from that. So these are things that we have had absolutely zero conversations about, and even the Republican movement in Canada, such as it is, has no position on this, has no real consensus or thoughts or discussions or anything like that. So that's why these polls wind up being really stupid, because you're asking a binary yes-no position to the monarchy when it's really a yes monarchy or symbolic president, appointed head of state, empowered elected president, so on and so on and so on. And that's not even discussing the constitutional mechanisms by which we would need to get to that position. So there's a whole lot in there that we really need to consider when we have this conversation. I'm personally of the school of it's not broken, so we shouldn't fix it. But not everyone feels this way. But if we want to have this conversation, we should have it honestly, which a lot of people are not. We should not rely on particular falsehoods about how much the monarchy costs us, because it actually costs us almost nothing. We timeshare the natural person with 15 other realms, I believe. The UK picking up the most of that. We only pay when they do visits in Canada, which are not very common and cost far less by an order of magnitude than when an American president comes to visit for an afternoon or a day. Or anything like that. So they're not even comparable. We are, not only the cost to run an election would be astronomical, but an elected president would have a democratic mandate to spend. And that is the other thing that nobody wants to talk about, particularly when they complain about the current system and how much they think it costs, without even thinking about the counterfactual there either. So these are conversations that if people want to have a conversation about replacing the monarchy, should be having. But nobody really has, because nobody actually sits to think about what the consequences of that would be. So these are just a few things to think about. Again, like I said, I'm of the school, if it's not broken, we shouldn't fix it. But if we do want to have this conversation, let's actually have it honestly, which nobody seems to want to do. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.